We know exactly what to do, and that's the really great thing.
Who is not happy making a mud pie with a pair of sticks?
They run for an hour, kill the beast, bring it back, and then just sit around.
Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. I'm Will Rycroft, and in this week's episode we're going to venture outside. Take a quick glance inside any good bookshop and you'll usually find a table piled high with excellent books on the natural world. Publishing on nature, landscape and the human interaction with it is booming. So if you're the kind of person who likes an autumnal walk, then come and kick through some leaves with us over the next half hour or so. And if you're comfier on the sofa, then that's one of the things that podcasting is perfect for. We'll be hearing from writer and climate activist Rebecca Solnit, Professor of Experimental Brain Research Shane O'Mara, and joining me in the studio is a man who has helped to redefine what nature writing looks like in the 21st century. Beginning with Mountains of the Mind, Robert Macfarlane has taken his readers on a descending journey through the wild places, along the old ways, defending language with books like Landmarks and The Lost Words, before taking us to subterranean depths with Underland, a book that helped him add the Wainwright Prize to his frankly groaning trophy shelf. Robert, it is a complete pleasure to have you here.
Hello, Will. Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry to embarrass you with mention of your trophies, but you have won an awful lot of awards.
Well, there was the under-12 runner-up in Footballer of the County competition, if that's what you're referring
That
to.
is obviously what I'm referring to.
Yeah, that's my proudest moment as a prize winner.
Do you still have that?
I do still have it. I'm terrible at football, but I kept that one.
You have written a series of books now which have a very different sort of perspective on the landscape in each one. And as I say, it has almost been this descending journey, starting off in the mountains and ending up underground. It seems very ordered when I put it like that, but I can't believe that you sort of foresaw that you were going to write books in that order. So could you tell me a bit about the genesis of these books? When you're going out and you're on a mountain walk or you're walking through the fens, whatever, when is the point at which you realise this is a book and this is what that book will look like?
There is no point. Books grow, and you can't tell where their roots start. It's like looking at a tree and trying to know when that seed fell and was dropped. You can't foresee that. So I tend to take a very long time over the books that I write. The first one I published when I was 27, so it took about 27 years to write. And subsequent to that, they've been sort of 3, 5, even 7 years in the writing. So, and no, I didn't foresee this gradient of descent, as you say, from the mountaintops to the Underland. But that's the way it's shaken out. I suppose it's following what is mysterious to me and what is wonderful to me, and that's led me to some strange places.
And do you find that those thoughts occur to you whilst you're sort of in the act of walking? Are you the kind of person who does walk and think and mull things over?
I think very well when I'm walking, and I think even better, or at least even faster, when I'm running. And I've often found that in long days of sitting writing, which really is the only tip I have for writing, is bum on the seat, turn up, put the hours in, put the bricks in the hod. But if things get stuck, I tend to go out and move through the outside, and it does help without a doubt.
We should mention Underland before we actually get to your new book, which I haven't mentioned yet. But Underland is a book which, as I say, it takes us under the landscape that we can all see, and therefore finds interesting myths and stories, because what you're doing with your writing all the time is connecting landscape to language and then also to storytelling. Is that a fair sort of assessment?
Yeah, or culture very broadly understood. I sometimes think of it as what we hold in the heart, as well as what we hold in the mouth in the form of language, and I guess in the mind in the form of memory and myth. So I've always been fascinated how landscapes compel people, sometimes to appalling things. Ethno-nationalism is effectively a heavy investment in an idea of belonging to a particular landscape that incites people to exclude and to kill. But landscapes also compel us to absurdity. Mountain climbing is, when you look at it, a very, very odd thing to do for love of ice and stone and high altitude and sunshine, which do not love us back. But we also are filled, are plenished, are nourished by nature in ways we find very hard to explain, but unmistakable to experience.
There is something that you mentioned there about mountain climbing being slightly mad thing to do. And there is something about the fact that that was the first book that you wrote in your youth, if you like, and that's the kind of thing that, when you are young, you do these fearless things because you do have a sense of immortality, like nothing you can do is ever going to hurt you. Whereas Underland has very much more a sense of mortality as we head where bodies are buried. And is part of that connected to your own, I suppose, aging and sort of seeing the world in a slightly different way?
It is. It absolutely is. I mean, not only do you not think you can hurt yourself at times when you're young, but you also don't think you can hurt other people. And that's in a way the bigger insensitivity, as it were. I gave up serious mountain climbing when I just before I got married, and it still looks like a craziness to me. I mean, you will have seen, everyone saw, I think, that photograph in May in the climbing weather window on Everest of 220 people queuing at 8,800 meters on the Hillary Step for effectively a selfie. And they were all dying slowly. Many and a number of them did die, and they were also putting others at risk and the hearts of loved ones at risk as well. So that has intensified to a point of madness. But the underworld is a more, I think, resonant space when it comes to thinking about responsibility, both for what's being left for future generations, but also, as you say, that's where we've put the dead since before we've been anatomically modern humans.
As well as writing what I guess we would term as being your sort of non-fiction writing about the landscape, which of course ties together with myth and storytelling, you also create your own storytelling. Some of your collaborative projects in particular have been like that. So you worked together with the artist Jackie Morris to produce that incredible book, The Lost Words. And your latest book, Ness, you've put together with Stanley Donwood. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Ness is... I thought Underland was strange and dark. Ness is far stranger and far darker. I find it hard to describe. I think it's a rewrite of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in a sense, for the Anthropocene. It's a sort of a superhero story, but the superheroes are more than human forces. And it's set on this island called Ness, and there a ceremony is underway, which is really a ceremony of kind of power and technocratic violence, being led by this figure called the Armourer, who is a little bit like a number of public figures today, let us say, but no one in particular. And converging on this island, Ness, are these 5 more than human forces who we meet. And the poem, if that's what it is, the novella, the play, the performance, unfolds the telling of what happens as and when they converge.
There seems to be something particularly apposite about trying to talk about the beauty of the natural world whilst a very loud helicopter circles us overhead.
Yeah, in an odd way, yes, that's right. That is technology rampant. But this isn't, in a sense, beauty. It's almost power. Actually, it's almost. This is a sort of a deep time look at this return. I was thinking about Beowulf, one of our great founding poems, and in a way, that's a poem about the wilderness, the wildeor in Old English, being crushed by a military force. The Geats, Beowulf, go out, they go to the moor, they go to the loch, and they kill the wild things that live there brutally. This is sort of a reversal of that, where nature itself is converging and beginning to come to life and to push back against human presence and human violation in ways that I don't quite understand, but are clearly condensing things that are in the air right now.
You have led us very beautifully to our first author that we're going to listen to, with 2 things, I suppose. The idea of power is one of the topics that's going to be very important, and that idea of the natural world fighting back, because we're living in an age where it needs to fight back, or we need to do something about it. It would, of course, be impossible for us to talk about the world outside without dealing with the topic that should be engaging everyone listening, which is that of climate change. Rebecca Solnit is an American writer whose essays have touched on many subjects in the past, like art and feminism and politics and, of course, the environment. Her latest collection, Whose Story Is This?, focuses on power and indeed storytelling. This idea of, in the wake of Trump and Weinstein and Kavanaugh and Me Too, who gets to control the story. Also in that collection there is a letter of thanks which is written to the climate strikers from earlier this year, and I spoke to her about whether activism itself was at a tipping point, and if she's hopeful for the future of our planet.
One of the great fallacies of the left to which I belong is that with every problem we're starting from scratch. It's like we should do something. Great things are being done. I believe the UK is now getting more electricity from renewables than it is from coal. You had some historic day this summer when coal fell into the shade in a way it hasn't been in 200 years or something. A great deal is happening, both as activism turning into legislation, transformations of energy systems. Wind and solar in most parts of the world are now more affordable, more effective than burning fossil fuel. The bottom has fallen out of profits on fracking and coal mining. So a lot's happening, and a lot is not nearly what needs to be happening. We need to make a swift, profound transition away from fossil fuels. We need to change energy systems, transportation systems, how we live, how we grow food, how we take care of forests, and so many other things. We know exactly what to do, and that's the really great thing. We have the technology, as we did not 20 years ago, to make the transition. The only thing lacking is the political will. The only problem are the political obstacles, which are both the innate conservatism of people in power and an immense influence of the fossil fuel corporations and related corrupt institutions. So the question is, how do we get it done? And we need to be an irresistible force, a critical mass, although that's sort of a nuclear metaphor I'm not sure we should use. The climate movement is a profoundly different thing than it was a year ago. The rise of Greta Thunberg, the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Sunrise Movement in the US, Extinction Rebellion and the UK, and a lot of other groups around the world. The beginning of far more politicians to taking it as seriously as it needs to be taken. The media reporting finally on it the way they should have been reporting on it for the past 40 years. We could, if we push really hard on the great global climate strike and don't let up, produce the circumstances, not that save us or prevent climate change or make the bad things all go away, but what we're trying to do in this moment is choose the best case scenario, and there is a best case scenario if we do all these things swiftly and effectively over the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is 1.5 degrees of warming, although we're over 1 already, and what it would look like to reverse some of the stuff we've built in is a big scientific conversation, versus the status quo, which will produce several degrees in the foreseeable future that will be destructive in ways that I think are for most people really unimaginable in terms of the level of chaos, of crop failure, of famine, of places that become uninhabitable, of sea level rise, of devastated and transformed ecologies, extinctions, etc. So the fact that we're actually engaging with it is for me kind of exciting, because I've been focused on this for maybe 20 years. And it is really hard to get people to care about long-term arcs of change, complex scientific issues, things that might not affect them personally, things that require just a great deal of really kind of studying to understand the way that soil sequesters carbon and trees do as well, that forestry matters, the ways that feedback cycles work, the way that the ice and snow in the poles reflects back sunlight. And the fact that people have learned this and turned it into a deep moral passion to do something, and so many are doing it, is so different than where we were 10 years ago. So I'm still hopeful, which is not the same thing as confident or optimistic, but I still think we might get quite a lot done, and that everything depends on doing it.
There seems to have been, as you say, in the last year or so, there's been a real change in what climate protest looks like, with far wider groups of people being involved in it, and particularly that younger generation, the generation who are going to be affected by it, daring to get out there and make their voices heard. Is it a numbers game? Is it a question of getting enough people out there, outside, protesting about things like this to actually make things happen? Or is it about kind of laser-guided, focused attention on the people who are actually in power?
My friend Erica Chenoweth did the research work to show that 3.5% of a population is adequate to topple a regime non-violently in most cases. We don't need everybody, we need a lot of people, but it's also about strategy. How does that work? Where does it work? How do you convince the rest of the population? How does an idea, the abolition of slavery, for example, go from being something a few people dismissed as crackpots or dreamers or marginal people go to become what everybody thinks and people don't remember they didn't think? How do we don't know how we get there. I do remember thinking a year or two ago, the climate movement needs something, I don't know what, and I didn't foresee the power that this then 15-year-old girl from Sweden would have. I didn't foresee the power of the Green New Deal, not only in the US, where it may or may not become policy, but to set a new, more radical set of goals and ideals for what we should achieve, and get past the old stupid idea that jobs and the environment are somehow at war with each other, to see that actually transitioning away from fossil fuel to renewables could be a very good employment scheme as well. And so it also depends on who, we do need people in the U.S. government, people in parliament, etc., to get behind this, and some are. Electoral politics do matter, although they're not the only thing that matters. They're often portrayed as what leads us, but it's very clear that in their cravenness, they generally follow public opinion and the will of the people. So the will of the people is kind of the great thing that matters, whether it's 3.5% or a great mass. What we know from surveys is that here, enormously, even in the US, a huge majority want to see profound action on climate, are ready for things to change, are willing to accommodate those changes. And, we need to keep striving. We need to do it intelligently. It's not only about lots of people in the streets. It's about having that coupled with proposals, agendas, legislation, and data, journalism. It's really kind of getting all the pieces to work together. And that is happening in a way it hasn't before. What the consequences will be remain to be seen. And that's a profound uncertainty that could produce nothing but could also produce everything.
Well, it's great hearing that unmistakable voice, and it's one I know very well, because Rebecca and I have been friends for a long time, nearly 15 years now. And in that time, we've spent most of our time together walking.
Right.
Outside. We both love walking, we both love talking, and best of all, we love doing the two together. And our conversations over those many miles in California and predominantly in Cambridgeshire have revolved around those questions you were discussing with Rebecca now, and they've gathered in urgency, and they've gathered in force, and wonderfully they've flowered over the past year into this new public presentation of these questions and these issues.
Your mention of walking with Rebecca amongst the redwoods of California has reminded me of Richard Powers' novel, The Ogre Story, which was, one of my favourite reads of recent years. Incredible book, which is about
protest.
Protest and the landscape and the environment and how it changes over time. It contains a lot of science, a lot of fact, but also a lot of emotion. This idea of people caring so much about the world. And in fact, that Richard had cared about it so much whilst researching the book that it's changed his life. He's moved to be
Smokies.
Amongst a forest, he's surrounded by trees. And when I spoke to him, he was speaking about that very simple thing of being amongst these giant trees that are hundreds of years old does something very good to you as a person in terms of perspective and calmness, and he found it very, very useful. You must have that every time you're in the natural environment when you're walking and looking at the world?
Well, we could call it tree time, seeing and feeling and thinking in tree time, which is slightly different to the deep time that I've been writing a lot about recently in Underland and Ness. But both of these longer cross-generational timescales are, I think, suddenly really active in literature, but also in politics. That, in a sense, the climate movement is now saying, look at what we are leaving. Greta is saying, look at what you're leaving for me and my generation, but look also at what you're leaving for what Rebecca, I think, in the letter in her book calls the ghostly billions yet unborn. And this sense, there's a beautiful question asked by the Nobel Prize-winning immunologist Jonas Salk, who's basically been responsible for eradicating polio. This is a person who left a legacy for generations to come. He asks this searching question, are we being good ancestors? And to be a good ancestor is different to being a good parent or a good grandparent. It's taking responsibility for people you will never meet, people you will never see, even species you will never know. That is good ancestorship, and it's hard work. But that's also what's at stake in the current conversations, I think.
Rebecca is the kind of author who, it doesn't matter what she writes about, I find my brain always fizzing after reading it. She has actually, one of her previous books, Wanderlust, is a book, a sort of a biography of walking, and looks at it through time. We've already spoken about how you and Rebecca have walked and talked and find that sort of stimulating in your brains. But I wonder how many of our listeners have actually considered what the act of walking entails for our brain, and what that evolutionary significance of that might be. Our next author is going to help us here. So Shane O'Mara is a professor of experimental brain research at Trinity College in Dublin. He's written previously about why torture doesn't work, and has even delivered a TED talk about the neuroscience behind zombies. If you haven't seen it, you can look it up on YouTube. It's very, very entertaining. In his new book, In Praise of Walking, he shows why walking is more miraculous than you might think, and it absolutely defines who we are as humans. How better to talk about those ideas than whilst having a stroll through London? Shane, we are in Green Park in central London. It's not the nicest day, but we are walking because walking is very important for all sorts of reasons. Let's start off with, I suppose, the thing that makes us possibly a little bit unique, but maybe not entirely, which is the walking on two legs. That there is something important there, isn't there?
Yeah, so humans are a very unusual species in the way that we walk. Now, there are other bipedal species like birds who do walk upright, but actually their primary mode of transport often is to fly. But humans make a transition which is absolutely unique in the animal kingdom. So we're born with four limbs, and initially we crawl around on four limbs, and we look to all intents and purposes like quadrupeds. But at around the age of 12 months or so, something starts to change, and and what starts to change is something which is entirely commonplace, but deeply worrying if it doesn't happen. We start to flop onto our bum, and we start to pull ourselves up into an inherently unstable position. We start to walk on two legs, and this frees our hands, and I would contend also frees our minds. So when we move on to two legs, that very act changes lots about how our brain functions. Genetic programs in the spinal cord and in the brain unfold, and all we need is space to move around in, and we will transition to being walkers without being explicitly trained. And of course, neither of us have memories of when we learned how to walk at all. Your parents might have stories about how you did something silly, but that's about it. But what happens then is a whole series of other changes kick into play. You become a very fluent speaker, but also you become very good at gesture. You become very good at interacting with others in the sense of getting them to pay shared attention with you to other positions in space. So you can point to somewhere and somebody will follow the position that you're pointing to. And you get very good at synchronizing your behavior with others. So children learn to walk together, they learn to walk with adults, they learn to keep pace with each other, and a whole lot of other things besides. And these cause widespread changes in the organization of the brain.
So is there something that happens to your brain when you're walking? People often use that as a sort of a time to think, a time to unlock their creative thoughts, a time to sort of often come to some kind of eureka moment. Often, why does that happen when we're walking as opposed to being still in space?
Yeah, so I don't think we've a very good answer, but I think we've got a couple of potential answers. So if I bring you to the lab to do a test of creativity with you, one way of doing this is to give you a bunch of common household objects, knives, spoons, jars and the like, and say to you, come up with as many uses for each of these in 2 minutes as you possibly can. And you may come up with, let's say, 10 uses for each object, an alternative use. However, if I get you to walk and then do the task, on average you'll come up with about twice as many ideas than compared to the seated condition. And I think when you look at what happens in the brain when you're standing versus the brain when you're sitting, everything changes when you're up on your 2 feet. Your blood pressure changes, rhythms which were previously quiet in the brain are suddenly activated, your rate of breathing changes, your head becomes more mobile than it was previously, and at least one way of thinking about it is that you're recruiting parts of the brain that were previously quiescent, and the kind of association of ideas that were just below consciousness now rise to threshold into consciousness.
And many of us now lead quite sedentary existences because we either work in an office or there's huge amounts of time sat watching TV or spending time on screens. And I often find in my work that I have to get up from my desk quite regularly, otherwise it's just sort of deadening spiritually, but also quite physically exhausting to sit still. How does that work?
You know, we don't actually realise the extent to which sitting is fatiguing, and it's fatiguing for all sorts of reasons. Our bodies are built for movement, but when we're sitting in positions that are actually kind of unnatural for us. When we're walking, we're placing all of the weight on what are 2 wonderfully designed platforms, our feet. Whereas when we're sitting, we're placing all our body weight on the small of our back, and it's little wonder, especially given poor seat design, that so many people have back pain. Astonishing that more people don't realise the cure. Get up regularly and move around. And we humans have this kind of 2 tendencies built into us by evolution. We're built for movement, and we're built to walk very, very long distances every day, from early in life until late in life, but we're also built to be lazy. In other words, to conserve energy. And what we've done in the modern world is solve the problem of food sourcing by and large. After we finish here, we can pop to any number of shops in Piccadilly and get food. But the problem of movement is one that we haven't really thought about, and it's a problem that we haven't actually got to grips with, that we do need to design our workspaces so that people are active, and that there's some stress, positive stress being placed on our heart, on our lungs, on our muscles, because the body responds to that in positive ways.
There is obviously something slight. We can all see the convenience of going to a gym, for example, to run on a treadmill. But there is something, it seems to me, inherently different about doing that run outside or walking outside. There's something possibly about fresh air, about the reality of terrain that isn't flat and automated. Why does that make a difference?
So before I answer that, let me talk about the gym issue more particularly. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm too much down on gyms, but what is frequently realised now is that people who hit the gym for an hour after work actually put on weight, because we don't take account of the total energy expenditure across the whole day. So if you've had a day of inactivity, you then hit the gym and you exercise yourself at a high rate for an hour, it's likely that exercise is going to induce a greater level of inactivity than you would have had you not done any exercise at all. It's the phenomenon of exercise-induced inactivity, and this is seen in humans who live in tribal societies where they have to hunt. They engage in persistence hunting. They run for an hour, kill the beast, bring it back, and then just sit around. So the problem is not the gym. The problem is the total amount of activity that we engage in during the course of the day. And again, as I said, we don't have our urban centres designed well for people to actually engage in more movement during the course of the day.
Shane, in the course of this short walk, you have given me the perfect excuse to A, not hit the gym, and B, get up from my desk at regular intervals.
Absolutely, and if your boss gets onto you about getting up for your desk, tell him you're enhancing your own well-being and creativity, and you're going to be more effective and more productive at your job simply because you have been a mind in motion.
Okay, I'm gonna quote that verbatim.
Do.
Shane, a great pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great.
Fascinating stuff there from Shane. I mean, the weird thing is that we were walking through London, and even in a metropolis like London, there is actually a huge amount of green space. Yeah. We were walking through a park there because it was a bit quiet than obviously walking through Piccadilly Circus, but just walking through those parks and connecting with nature in that way reminds you that it is there for anybody to use and access, even more so if you're living in the countryside. But we either take it for granted or just sort of forget that it's there. But there is a joy, isn't there, of just simply being outside.
There is. I love the fact that London has recently, as you might know, been officially designated a national park city, the world's first national park city. So it now has a comparable designation to the Lake District, the South Downs, the Cairngorms National Parks. Sadiq Khan is very behind this. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Cities are incredible biodiversity hubs. Cemeteries, amazing. Canals, incredible. All of these sort of ecotone-like strips that move through our cities that carry life within them. And there is absolutely joy and wonder to be found in them, and in what Tim Dee calls the running sky, the sky filled with birds. Children are the best at this. I mean, if you ever forget why your heart lifts when you're out, then just spend a little bit of time with a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old in a wood or a city park. They're just, I always say they're naturals at nature. They have to learn to forget astonishment, and that's something we should never really do.
I have 2 children, and they always forget that they love being outside. So when you say to them, we're going to go for a walk, and they're like, they don't want to do it. But of course, it's a matter of minutes of being outside. Yep. And they have completely forgotten that, and they are running around and doing all the things that they... And it's always on the way back home, I have to kind of go, you forgot how much you love being outside.
But then they re-forget.
Yeah, right? Every time.
One thing I love about children, of course we do it a little bit too, we adults, but they meet the landscape with their bodies as well as their eyes, and with language, but in this sort of wild way. They touch it, they eat it, they lie down on it, they roll around in it, and it's this fantastically kind of creaturely comfort that comes from touching the green world, as it were. And again, that's something we don't do. I remembered at the weekend that I hadn't walked barefoot for a really, really long time. The last time I walked barefoot, I was walking the South Downs with Bill Bailey, which he does every summer. And he said, come join me for a day. So I went and joined him for a day. And we were about 3 miles in, and I said, come on, Bill, let's take our shoes off. So he said, all right. So we did, and we did 7 or 8 miles barefoot along the chalk, and we found a jay feather, and sometimes we swore a bit as we stepped on a thistle or some tarmac, but you felt the landscape differently. We were basically being big kids for a little while.
There is something, isn't there, about the fact that our feet used to be very used to walking, in the natural world, and obviously now because we have shoes that they're not, and so it is painful. And we inure ourselves to the world. We keep ourselves clean. We're slightly germophobic and things like that. And as you say, that thing of being out in nature, getting dirty, kids are quite happy to eat a mouthful of sand or dirt when they're out, and it doesn't do them any harm. It probably does them a bit of good. But we in the 21st century, we seem to be so sort of disconnected from that, in the thought that technology has taken us above it, but we need maybe to connect with it a little bit more.
Well, we do. I have to confess, I'm always very suspicious of the word connect and disconnect, because I always think it figures the whole situation as like a toaster that stopped toasting bread. It's like, fine, if we could just plug it back in, and we can toast our bread again. It's obviously, as you know, as we all know, it's much more complicated than that, and it's socially structured, economically structured, so on. But the fact is that when nature is made accessible, which it by no means is always within cities, but also within rural communities, then it becomes a living, convivial space where children are learning with one another, with nature. I would love to see much more ease of outdoor learning within the British school system. I would like to see natural history and nature sort of grained into, and indeed agriculture grained into, our primary and secondary school systems. I'd like to see the Education Act rewritten to have the natural world placed at the fountainhead of the way our education unfolds in this country.
Well, I can tell you that one of my sons, who I mentioned earlier, his favourite thing at nursery was they had an outdoor kitchen where you could make mud pies, basically.
Yeah.
And I think really that's what he would like school to be forever.
It's one long mud pie galley.
That was where he was happiest, and he finds the whole schoolwork classroom thing really very tedious. But yeah, really happy outside.
Who is not happy making a mud pie with a pair of sticks?
I feel like we should go and do this right now. We can't do that, however. What we're going to do now is take our little tour of the country. We're going to hear from our booksellers as they provide their book recommendations based on this theme of outside. What will they have for us?
Hi, I'm Ellie from The Economist Bookshop, and a great book to read about outside would be Modern Nature by Derek Jarman, because it's an inspiring and humbling testament of beauty and survival in adverse conditions, both in Jarman's rural garden and in wider urban spaces where climates of prejudice towards homosexuality and AIDS were still rife.
Hi, I'm Emily from Barnsley, and on the theme of outside, I would recommend Haunts of the Black Masseur, Swimmer as Hero by Charles Brothers, which is one of the most beautiful books ever written, and it is a history of swimming through experience and literary works and figures. And it's utterly beautiful, completely compelling, and it will make you want to swim the Hellespont.
Hi, I'm Katrina from Glasgow. My recommendation on the subject of outside is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I think this book is what made getting outside, building a den, exploring and using my imagination so easy as a child, and it stayed with me my whole life, and I still love going outside to go exploring in the hope that I stumble across something secret and magical.
For next week's episode, we've decided it's high time we got some culture. We're all about the books here, but we're also going to go to the movies with Richard Ayoade, surf the internet with Gia Tolentino, and go post-punk with cultural icon Debbie Harry. It promises to be a cracker, so we hope that you will join us in a week's time. Until then, from Robert and I, it's farewell for now.
Goodbye.